Welcome, everyone. I think we can go ahead and get started. I'd like to introduce Jonathan Servas, who is a postdoctoral fellow here in the Institute for Politics and Strategy.
Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending this really special election week town hall for the Institute of Politics and Strategy with Congressman Mike Doyle. My name is Jonathan Servas. I recently received my PhD from the University of California, Irvine. My research interests include the study of American elections, how elections facilitate representation, and especially legislative redistricting. I have personally redrawn maps for 3 jurisdictions for the US federal courts after lawsuits for racial gerrymandering, including the Virginia legislature. This spring, I'll be teaching an undergraduate course on representation and redistricting, and we'll be producing maps that will be delivered to the Pennsylvania legislature for possible adoption. I invite you to follow the Institute for Politics and Strategy on social media at CMU IPS, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We are very pleased today to have Representative Mike Doyle joining us. We are especially grateful that Representative Doyle will be with us on a day before an important election in which he will be on the ballot. Representative Doyle is currently serving his 13th term in Congress. He represents the 18th district, which includes the city of Pittsburgh and 53 other communities in Allegheny County. His top priorities include creating jobs and revitalizing communities in the 18th district, reforming healthcare, and establishing a comprehensive national energy strategy to curb climate change and create green jobs. Congressman Doyle, serves on the House Energy and Commerce Committee, which is one of the 4 most exclusive committees in the House. Congressman Doyle has been working aggressively on this committee to address climate change through the development of new, more energy efficient technology and alternatives and renewable sources of energy. Congressman Doyle is a member of the House Democratic Caucus and the founder and co-chair of the Congressional Autism Caucus, also known as the Coalition for Autism Research and Education, or CARE. Congressman Doyle also co-founded and chairs the House Robotics Caucus, which works to ensure that our nation remains globally competitive in the field of robotics. It is my distinct privilege to welcome the Congressman, a member of my favorite political institution, the People's House. Without further ado, please use your reaction buttons to welcome Congressman Mike Doyle.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me here today. I always enjoy talking with students and faculty at our universities. You're the intellectual firepower that's helped transform our region here in Pittsburgh. And I'd like to brag with my colleagues in DC, the role that you've all played in Pittsburgh's economic recovery. Carnegie Mellon in particular is not only world-renowned university, but it's also been the driver of some of my work in DC. After Pittsburgh's steel industry collapsed, I joined other local leaders in working to rebuild Pittsburgh's economy by focusing on the biggest assets remaining in our region, our world-class research institutions. And much of the transformation that we've seen in Pittsburgh is a result of those efforts. I'd like to take a few minutes to introduce myself and give you an overview of my work in Congress. Then I'm happy to spend the remainder of my town hall talking, taking your questions and hearing your comments. As was said, I sit on the Energy and Commerce Committee, which is one of the exclusive committees in the House. Congress gets a lot of our authority from the Commerce Clause in the Constitution. And most of the business, industry, and policy making that goes on in Washington, D.C. is related to commerce. We have policy jurisdiction over, for example, healthcare, energy and the environment, technology and telecommunications, and consumer protection. One of the jokes about the Energy and Commerce Committee is that most of the policy world is under our jurisdiction. So it's an exciting place to be in and a committee I've enjoyed serving on. In many ways, it's also one of the most bipartisan committees in Congress. A lot of the bills that have become law over the last 4 years in this contentious environment that we have come out of our committee. Now, they might not get all that much media attention, but it's really something our committee's proud of and values. In Congress, your committee assignment dictates where you spend the most time and which policy areas you focus on the most. And for me, that means healthcare energy and the environment, and telecommunications. Within the healthcare space, my focus has been on expanding access and trying to make our healthcare system more affordable and equitable. As you all know, the most significant reform of the last decade in healthcare was the Affordable Care Act, which passed in 2010. You know, it's hard to remember how bad the situation was for millions of Americans before the ACA, but it was pretty desperate. By 2010, healthcare costs had doubled over the previous 10 years, and more than 30 million Americans had no health insurance. And many of those with health insurance lived in fear of losing their job and having to go without. Those with insurance also faced discrimination on the basis of pre-existing conditions, gender, and age, and they were often forced into plans with annual and lifetime limits for coverage. The ACA was able to address those issues. We put in protections for people with pre-existing conditions, something that even the Republicans paid lip service to. We ended annual and lifetime caps. We required standards for insurance coverage, including preventative care with no cost sharing, and we ended discrimination based on gender. We were able to provide access to high quality, more affordable health insurance to more than 20 million people. This was no small feat, and I'm extremely proud of the work we did on the ACA. Now, there's a lot more to do to ensure truly equitable and affordable healthcare for all Americans, but the ACA was a major step forward. Interestingly enough, the majority of Americans have come to understand that, and that's why the Republicans couldn't repeal the ACA in 2017. In fact, they actually helped make the ACA more popular than ever before when people started thinking about what would happen if it were taken away. Of course, after the repeal effort failed, Republicans turned to the courts to try to toss out the ACA, and the Supreme Court is scheduled to hear arguments in that case next week, which is really scary and highlights the importance of elections. Now, we've always wanted to improve upon and expand the ACA. For example, House Democrats actually passed a version that included a public option back in 2009, but it was stripped out in the Senate. Putting a public option in place is going to be a major priority for a Biden administration and Democrats in Congress moving forward. Now, I'm a longtime supporter of Medicare for all, but as with the ACA, I will also gladly support incremental changes that make healthcare better and more affordable. Another focus of mine in the healthcare space has been autism spectrum disorders. I first became aware of the impact that autism has on families many years ago when I was working as chief of staff for a state senator. I met a man who came into the office. His name was Dan Turiski, and he had a son, Eddie, who had moderately severe autism. Dan and his late wife, Connie, had worked hard to make the most normal life possible for their son, but it took tremendous effort, and they were pretty much on their own. There just weren't many outside resources available back then. So I've been committed to helping such families since then. And when I first arrived in Congress, the federal government was doing very little to provide families affected by autism with the care and the services that they needed. We've started to change that. Along with Chris Smith, a Republican from New Jersey, I founded the bipartisan bicameral Congressional Coalition on Autism Research and Education, or CARE. For roughly 20 years now, Representative Smith and I have served as the co-chairs of CARE, or more commonly known as the Congressional Autism Caucus. The Autism Caucus's goals have been securing a substantial increase in research funding and ensuring that individuals with autism receive the highest quality treatments available. We work with advocacy groups like the Autism Society of America, Autism Speaks, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. The Congressional Autism Caucus has been able to dramatically expand federally funded research on ASD and other pervasive developmental disabilities. For example, funding for autism programs at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention increased from less than $300,000 in 1995 to more than $23 million in 2018. And during that same period, funding for autism research at NIH increased from 10 million to 190 million. A lot of this work has come through the Autism Cares legislation, which has been reauthorized multiple times since 2006, and most recently in 2019. In the new 2019 law, we've expanded the focus of federal autism resources to address the entire lifespan of individuals with ASD, moving beyond the initial focus on infants and children. But we all know we need to do more. Our new focus is expanding federal involvement and coordination of services and supports for individuals with ASD and their families. COVID-19 has really demonstrated the fragility of the support these individuals receive now, and that there's gaps that still exist. So we've been fighting to make sure that individuals with ASD and other developmental disabilities are helped by the COVID relief packages, including funding for home and community-based services, education funding, and continued support and relief for families. Of course, COVID-19 has highlighted disparities that exist throughout our healthcare system, especially for Black and Hispanic patients. They've been more likely to get COVID, more likely to be hospitalized, and more likely to die. Moreover, the impact of systemic racism during this pandemic is evident in more than just healthcare settings. Our Black and Latino neighbors are more likely to be frontline workers, meaning they haven't been able to work from home. They've struggled more financially during the pandemic, which makes sense because Black and Latino Americans have for generations had to overcome additional obstacles in order to attain levels of income, assets, and wealth on par with white Americans. Notably, these minority communities have also reported pandemic-related mental health concerns at a rate approximately 10 times higher than their white counterpart. Now, COVID-19 didn't cause these disparities, it highlighted them. And we as policymakers and American citizens mustn't ignore them any longer. Another area where systemic racism is evident is in climate change and the environment, another focus of mine in Congress. Climate change is a global crisis that is already impacting communities across the nation through droughts, wildfires, worse hurricanes, and more severe weather patterns. So we must act aggressively to combat climate change and get to net zero carbon emissions by 2050. That's the target set by the Paris Climate Accord, and it's what the climate scientists at the United National Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change say is realistic. Net zero by 2050 would keep us below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. Creating a cleaner economy and growing the economy are not incompatible, and in fact, there is tremendous potential for creating new jobs in the transition to a cleaner economy. We will need to develop new energy technologies, retrofit thousands of buildings, and manufacture, install, and operate all of the new cleaner equipment for starters. Tackling climate change provides us not only the opportunity to transition existing jobs here to cleaner jobs, but to make American companies leaders in new clean tech, which they can sell around the world, growing our economy. One great example is energy storage. I've introduced a bill to provide a tax credit, like solar and wind tax credits, for energy storage systems. Energy storage will allow us to make wind and solar more reliable and unlock their future potential as power sources. In order for that to happen, however, we will need to develop better storage than we now have, manufacture it and install it across the country, and that will lead to more of the same in renewables. I think most Americans understand that addressing climate change means cleaning up our energy system and creating new jobs. Because climate change is a crisis that demands aggressive response, I've been working with my colleagues on the Energy and Commerce Committee to develop comprehensive and aggressive climate legislation called the Clean Futures Act. This would put our power systems and much of our economy on a pathway to net zero by 2050. It would set a clean energy standard so that all of our electricity comes from clean sources by 2050. It would raise the fuel standards for cars and trucks. It would invest in energy efficiency and developing new technologies that can accelerate our transition to a cleaner economy. And as we work on this comprehensive climate legislation, we've also been passing bills that can make a difference right away. For example, The House of Representatives recently passed the Clean Energy and Jobs Innovation Act, which would provide hundreds of thousands of jobs making buildings more efficient, conducting research into innovative ideas, and manufacturing new cleaner products like more efficient air conditioning units. Another area where I've been active on the committee has been in the field of telecommunications. As chairman of the subcommittee on communications and technology, I get to set the agenda on most of the legislation addressing those issues. I decide what hearings to hold, which bills we're going to mark up. It's a position that's very powerful, but also comes with tremendous responsibility. Over the last 2 years, I've passed legislation to restore net neutrality, crack down on scam robocalls, and reallocate parts of the radiomagnetic spectrum to benefit consumers. And with regard to our oversight role, we've just had a hearing where we called in all of the FCC commissioners to appear before us and answer questions about the policies they pursued or proposed. So throughout my service on the Energy and Commerce Committee, I've been a leading advocate for consumer-oriented policies that enhance competition and promote innovation. I've been a champion of net neutrality and ensuring that our nation has a free and open internet. And I co-authored legislation which was signed into law, which allowed the creation of over 1,000 low-power community radio stations across the country, greatly expanding the diversity of voices on the radio. I've been a leading voice for calling for strong rules to preserve and protect the open internet, and I've worked for years to close the digital divide, increase the deployment of broadband internet, and increase competition in the broadband marketplace. In addition, I've led efforts to reform the business data service market and the Lifeline program. This is the program that provides low-income Americans with basic telecommunication services. I've worked successfully with other stakeholders to expand Lifeline to cover internet services, which I believe today are a necessity, not a luxury. Finally, let me close by talking about some of my recent work closer to home. Since COVID struck, I've been working nonstop to ensure that our district gets all the federal help it needs to survive and recover from the pandemic. I voted for the HEROES Act in May and for a modified version of the HEROES Act last month, both of which would extend the federal unemployment benefits through January, provide another round of stimulus checks, provide support for state and local governments so that they don't have to lay off teachers and first responders, and target more help for small mom and pop businesses, especially our restaurant industry. I've also been working to address the racial inequities that have become so obvious during this pandemic, helping to direct more resources to underserved communities. We've also been pushing for a national testing and contact tracing plan, which the administration so far has refused to establish. You know, it's been incredibly frustrating that Republicans in the Senate have refused to bring up legislation to help millions of Americans most in need of support right now, or even to help us get COVID under control. And everyone knows that until we control the virus, we will never be able to sustainably reopen our economy. We have to do more to help families and businesses get through this. And when we do get our economy back on track, we must ensure it works for everyone. I have always believed in the dignity of work. I support a $15 minimum wage so that no one working full-time has to live in poverty. I also believe the best advocates for worker rights are the workers themselves, which is why I've been pushing for expanding the opportunities for workers to organize and join unions, which has provided better wages and benefits on average than non-unionized workplaces. You know, the government should also invest heavily in making sure all Americans have the skills they need for the jobs they want. And of course, I believe we need to invest in rebuilding our nation's crumbling infrastructure, which will create good paying jobs, build the world-class foundation necessary to grow our economy. So if, as I hope, the elections tomorrow result in a Democratic president, Senate, and House come January, I'm optimistic we'll be able to make progress on all the issues I've touched on in my remarks. I think we'll be in for more partisan gridlock if the Senate or the White House remains in Republican hands. So, as the saying goes, elections do have consequences. And I guess we'll find out tomorrow or maybe with the vote counting that has to go on, maybe by the end of the week, hopefully, what our government's going to look like as we go into the 117th Congress. So with that closing thought, I'm happy to move on to the question and answer segment and to hear your concerns. So I'll turn it back to you, Allie.
Thank you so much. And thank you for such great remarks. We will start with a couple of questions that were submitted in advance, but if over the course of this Q&A session you have questions that you'd like to ask live, please use the raise hand function and I will call on you. If you would like to submit an anonymous comment or question, please feel free to send me a private message in the chat. So with that, Congressman Doyle, could you talk a little bit more about the importance of local government in today's democracy, and what is the pathway to giving them more agency in making decisions?
Yeah, I'm a great believer in supporter of local governments. They play a very important role in our country because local governments really provide many of the services that touch Americans every day. Even if a lot of that funding for the services come from the federal government, they're the ones actually implementing the programs. I actually started in local government. I was a borough councilman in Swissvale Borough, where I grew up. And I could tell you, you're right there with your constituents that want to know, why their streets aren't paved, or issues, around policing and others. And back in the 70s, there was a lot more federal support for local government than there is today. Many local governments find themselves having to deal with a lot more complex problems with a lot less partnership and revenues from the federal government. So I think, one of the things we need to do, and obviously, to get a COVID relief package, is we've seen local governments, their revenues have been cut as a result of this pandemic, but their pandemic related expenses have gone up and they're hurting right now. So I think it's very much important that we get them the resources they need to be able to deliver the services that they have. I think the other big issue that has impacted local governments too has been the way the federal government has dealt with funding through block grants. Because what happens, initially the block grant looks like a lot of money, but over the years it doesn't keep pace with inflation. And local governments find themselves having to deliver the same services, and those prices go up, but the amount of revenue they have to help fund that has gone down. So I think in the federal government, we've seen like major housing, health, and social services block grants has fallen by about 27% after you adjust for inflation, and more than that when you throw in inflation and population growth. So the local governments have no way to make up for that. And then I think we see federal government saying we want to give more flexibility to state and local governments, and a lot of times what we really mean is we want to give them more responsibility to pay for those services instead of it coming from the federal government. I remember when I was on borough council in the 70s, the late 70s in Swissvale, we had 22 full-time police officers. Today, that borough has mostly part-timers and budgets that just can't afford, a force of full-time police officers. And we've seen the impact of that on policing when some of our officers are not properly trained and not paid very much. So I just think that federal government has a responsibility to be more of a partner with that. And our aging infrastructure, Allegheny County is a perfect example. We have 83 communities under a federal consent decree between the EPA and the Department of Justice for sanitary sewer overflows and combined sewer overflows. And the correction for that problem is in the $2 to $3 billion range, which if you put that all on ratepayers, people aren't going to be able to pay their sewage bills. They're already twice their water bills. So, if we expect local governments to be able to deliver the services that we're asking them to do and that people come to expect from them, the federal government needs to be more of a partner in helping to finance that.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about your work with the Autism Caucus, more specifically some major accomplishments and maybe some major challenges that you've encountered?
Yeah, I remember when I first got to Congress, I didn't know much about autism until Dan Turisky came into our office one day screaming at me. And I saw the Rain Man. That was about my connection with autism. And so, Dan gave me a real education, he and his wife, Connie, and we tried to advocate in the state for him. But when I got to Congress, I initially was on the Veterans Committee, and there was a member of Congress from New Jersey, a Republican, Chris Smith, who just coincidentally one day started to talk to me about this spike in autism in Brick Township, New Jersey. And they thought it might have been caused by some environmental concern. And I was sort of relaying some of the work I had done in autism. And that's when we decided to form the caucus, because what we found out was very few members of Congress had any idea what autism was. And when we started to look to see what the funding was for research, our initial focus was let's get more money into research and find a cure, right? And when we found out what was being spent at NIH and the CDC, it was practically nothing. So the initial focus was on getting more money into research. What we started to understand is that, it was fine to do the research, and we continue to support research into what causes autism and look for breakthroughs. But we also discovered there were, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of families that were living this with children who had autism that weren't automatically, gonna be cured, and that they needed services and they needed help. So we shifted from a focus initially on funding research, once we got that money up where we wanted it to be, into providing services to families. And we focused really on getting services to families and healthcare services early on, because autism, the earlier you catch it, the better the chance is that through various health treatments that it's a spectrum, right? So there's some people on that spectrum that can be mainstreamed in schools, work, and lead fairly normal lives. There's some on the extreme one end of the spectrum that are, that don't believe they need any help. They're in certain fields, they're geniuses. But then you get on the other end of the spectrum, and you see some that are profoundly autistic, and they need more services, and sometimes institutionalization, although we've moved away from that. So that when you're dealing with a spectrum like that, what we wanted to do is try to catch it early, diagnose it early, because it wasn't being diagnosed right away. Doctors were missing that it was autism, and families didn't get treatment and help until their children maybe were 4, 5, 6 years old. So that was the initial focus. But now, more recently, in 2019, when we passed the reauthorization, we're focusing on these kids now that age out of services. Because after they become 21, they're no longer eligible for a lot of the services they were eligible for when they were children. So we're trying to look at the entire lifespan of people with autism and work with these advocacy groups, which have really been our support in Congress. When Chris and I tried to get members on the Autism Caucus, we couldn't get anyone to join. They didn't understand what it was or what we'd be doing. Some of these parent groups, these advocacy groups, came to us and said, "What can we do to help you guys?" And we said, "You could call your member of Congress up and ask them if they're in the Autism Caucus, and if not, why not?" I swear to God, it was maybe 2 weeks later, we had 180 members join the Autism Caucus because they started hearing from their constituents. So a lot of the work that the caucus has done has been driven by the families who have children with autism and these advocacy groups. But we're looking at that whole spectrum now.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions about recent events and things happening this week. Are you confident that Joe Biden will win back Obama-Trump voters?
I think that Joe Biden, I think we've learned some lessons from 4 years ago here in Pennsylvania. When you do an analysis of what happened in 2016, I think, quite frankly, our candidate then spent much of her time in just two cities, Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and didn't get out in some of these smaller cities like Erie and Scranton and Harrisburg and others. Biden's not made that mistake. He's hit a lot of not only the big markets, but the small towns too. The key in Pennsylvania, if you're a Democrat, is you need to run up big margins in Pittsburgh and Philly, but you also have to not get massacred in the rest of the state. And basically what happened in 2016 is you had a huge Republican turnout in the center part of the state. And our candidate didn't do much to cut those margins down. And there was a third party candidate running, which attracted some votes from, the more liberal wing of our party. Some people that had supported Bernie Sanders in the primary went to this third party candidate who got 60,000 votes. Hillary lost by 44. So a lot of that has changed in Pennsylvania. Mail-in voting has really changed the dynamic. This is the first time we have no excuse mail-in voting, and we sort of tested this in the primary. And I'll give you a good example. I had a competitive primary, okay? And normally in a presidential primary year, the turnout here in Allegheny County is somewhere between 29 to 35%. We did not have a presidential race in Pennsylvania. It had already been decided by the time our primary was coming. So you didn't have that dynamic of a hot presidential primary race driving votes. This mail-in vote resulted in my congressional district a 55% turnout, the largest turnout we've ever had in a primary in my congressional district in the 26 years that I've been running in primaries there. So we're seeing that in the general election now too. Here in Allegheny County, over 400,000 people have applied for mail-in ballots. In my primary, 2/3 of the vote was mail-in, only 1/3 at the polls. I think you're seeing that same dynamic play out in the general election, where we're going to have huge turnout, and much of the vote is already in. It's already been cast, and on election day we'll see some more. But I think that Joe Biden has done enough to make inroads in those red counties to keep those margins down. Think about Connor Lamb's first election when he was running in a Trump plus 20 district. He lost all the counties outside of Allegheny. He didn't get killed there. He went out and worked those counties and he cut those margins down. And then in Allegheny County, he had a big vote and he won that race by only 600 votes, but he won a district nobody thought could be won because it was overwhelmingly voted for Trump. The percentage in 2016 for Trump was less than 1%. I think we've made that margin up, and I'll be with the vice president tonight down at Heinz Field. We're having a big drive-in rally, and it is completely sold out because I have people all day long asking me if I can get them in. And the answer is no, I can't get you in. There's no more spaces left. But he's ending his campaign in Pennsylvania. I mean, they are barnstorming, both he and his wife and Kamala Harris and her husband are barnstorming our state. And I think it's, that he's ending his campaign here in Pennsylvania speaks to how important Pennsylvania is going to be to deciding who the next president is.
Absolutely. You took the question out of my mouth. I was going to see if you could get me in to see Lady Gaga tonight with Joe Biden.
It's funny when we did it
kidding.
early on before they announced Lady Gaga, the requests were coming in, but it wasn't overwhelming. Then the Lady Gaga thing got mentioned and like everybody wants to go to the drive-in rally. So it's anyways.
Absolutely. Well, it should be a great event and I'm glad it sold out. Absolutely.
Yeah.
So shifting gears a little bit, can you talk a little bit about your thoughts on expanding the Supreme Court?
Yeah, it's funny, as House members, we don't get much into judicial appointments because this is mainly a Senate function. But I think one thing we know is that a lot of us feel that confirming a Supreme Court justice 8 days before a presidential election was the wrong thing to do. I'm not saying they couldn't legally do it. They obviously could. The president has the ability to nominate and the Senate has the ability to advise and consent, and they had the votes to do it. The question is, how does this set the stage for the future? And not just in the Supreme Court. When you think about how many federal court judges that the Senate has been doing in lieu of doing their job passing legislation, by the way. We've sent them over 400 bills from the House, which sit in Mitch McConnell's graveyard because of his obsession with getting as many federal judges on the bench as he can. And they broke a record doing that. But, you know, many of those judges, when you look at the composition, 85% of those judges are white and 76% of them are male. Many of them were people who did not have the kind of courtroom experience or experience being a judge. They were picked primarily because of their ideological views. And that's going to have an impact on our country for years to come with these lifetime appointments. So I think a lot of us are supportive of the idea of putting together some sort of a commission to study what the impact of this has been and what can be done to address it. I won't get a chance to impact that as a member of the House in terms of, you know, how we look, how, you know, judges are confined. And I think the Senate also has to decide what they want to do with that 60 vote rule, because that's going to have a lot to say to change how this all works too. But I do think that it's going to ring kind of shallow if our Republican colleagues, you know, tell us when the shoe's on the other foot, you know, we shouldn't do those things. We saw this with Merrick Garland, and I think that's why this has left such a bad taste in many Democrats' mouth. And the fact that this appointment wasn't a one-for-one. It wasn't appointing, you know, a conservative justice that was leaving the bench with another conservative justice. This changed the balance of the court, which is why it's so impactful. And this new justice is 48 years old. So she's likely to be on the court for a long time. And so I think that's, you know, one of the reasons you've heard calls for, you know, what's being described as court packing or adding justices to the bench. I think Vice President Biden, soon to be President Biden, I hope, is going to look at this in a thoughtful way. I think his initial feelings is that he wouldn't necessarily favor court packing, but I think that it does need to be looked at given what the Republicans have done these last 2 years. And Mitch McConnell, by the way, making a statement that he's going to clean the plate with judicial appointments in the lame duck session. So, I mean, this continues unabated by the Senate while they leave millions of Americans struggling by refusing to even look at two of the packages, one that's been sitting up there for 6 months and the more recent one that we sent them. I think it's just really disgraceful. And whether or not this president will sign anything if he loses, you know, unless we put some sort of get out of jail free card in the package for him. But so I don't know. We'll see.
Thank you. We will move to take a couple of questions live. So Sujay, you are up first.
Yes, hello. I didn't know how to unmute myself. I have been trying to think of what question to ask you. So I'll ask you about healthcare specifically. So since we just talked about Supreme Court, let's kind of ignore the originalist arguments where they talk about, oh, like, because the Constitution says so, individual mandate's bad. Like, I think the thing to note with that is that the individual mandate is supposed to be about adverse selection issues where you're trying to prevent, you know, people selectively participating, driving up premiums, or not like, because the high-risk people will tend to go for those plans. So that goes into the whole thing of the Supreme Court deciding economic policy when, you know, their entire basis is about philosophical and legal arguments. So it's sort of a two-part question. It's like, should the Supreme Court have any say in economic public policy? And furthermore, how do you think public provision of goods and services will be impacted by the conservative-leaning court for years to come?
Wow. Well, I don't have a crystal ball, and I know there's a lot of concerns about what you brought up, and you know, just at a basic level, the way the individual mandate, as you have correctly suggested, was about making the risk pool, putting everybody in that pool so that good risk would help compensate for bad risk, and much like automobile insurance, where there's a mandate to have coverage. Good drivers often end up paying for drivers that aren't so good. And the idea is once we told insurance companies that you couldn't, select out sick people, pre-existing conditions, or if they somehow got in there, you could put a cap on what you'd pay in a year or what you'd pay in a lifetime. We said you can't discriminate like that anymore, or charging women more money than men. So once we took all that away, the insurance industry says, well, geez, if you do that, it's going to cost us a lot more money. And, one of the ways we decided to deal with that is saying, no, we're going to give you, everyone's going to have to buy insurance, and you're going to have young, healthy people in that risk pool that are going to pay a premium, but not impact the healthcare system very much. When the court struck that down, that really hurts how the risk pool was supposed to work. So whether or not it's proper for the Supreme Court to have a role in making decisions that impact, the economic considerations, I'm not sure. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm not sure that I'm an expert to speak on what the courts can and can't do from a legal standpoint. I do know that if the courts strike down more provisions of the ACA, we're going to have to go back to the drawing board. But one thing I want to make clear, when we passed that bill, we knew that there was still work to be done on that bill, and that we would be tweaking that bill as we saw how certain things we were trying worked or didn't work. We didn't have a partner with the Republican Party. They spent most of their time trying to repeal the legislation. Never really had a replacement for the legislation, because what they knew is that if you take away the pre-existing condition clause, which had become very popular in America, they knew they couldn't do that anymore. So they couldn't go back to those good old days. They realized that they weren't going to be able to make this any more affordable than it was the way it was written. Now we have a battle over whether or not the government should just have a Medicare for all system where everybody's automatically in the system. There's arguments about that. I've been a proponent of it just because when you look at the insurance industry, they don't lose money. Okay, they just don't. And we're paying more for our healthcare than anybody else in the world, and our outcomes aren't as good. So the idea that perhaps instead of paying what for many people are premiums they can't afford, because employers are more and more putting that weight on their employees. It used to be people had healthcare insurance from their employees and they paid the premium. When my father worked, my father was a steel worker. He worked in Braddock in the steel mill. His healthcare was paid for by U.S. Steel. There wasn't a contribution on his end. You look at people today, and they're paying, hundreds of dollars a month as their portion of the payment to get their health care. And you see their deductibles, in order to keep their premiums down, going way up, in their copays. There's got to be a better way to do it. And I just think when you have a middleman, because when you think about an insurance company, and I was in the insurance business, I'm still licensed to sell insurance. It's one of the first things I did out of college was work for an insurance company. When you think about what they do, they're sort of just like the middleman broker, right? They basically say, okay, we have all these customers, if you're a healthcare insurer, and they go to the providers, whether it's a pharma or whether it's a hospital or a doctor, and say, we'll pay you this much for this procedure. And if you're willing to take that, you can have these customers that we have, and they negotiate that. And the difference between, what they pay and what they collect in premiums is their profit. So when you have a profit-driven system like that, that profit doesn't get kicked back into people's healthcare. So the thing that makes, and when you think about a government-run healthcare system, people get afraid of. We've had it for years. It's called VA healthcare. That's a totally government-run healthcare system, right? The hospitals, the docs, everybody's an employee of the healthcare system. But having said all of that, okay, there's not the support or the votes to pass that right now. So instead, what we have to do is take what we have and improve it. And one of the ways I think we can improve it is to create this public option inside the Affordable Care Act. So I think, in the Biden administration, you're going to see us wait to see, first of all, what the Supreme Court does, and then go from there. But I think you're going to see initially from this administration efforts to improve the ACA, make it more accessible and affordable to people, and put in a public option as a way for people to lower, and get into a system that might lower their premiums. As far as what the court should or shouldn't be allowed to do legally, I'm out of my league there, so I want to venture an answer to that. I'm sure there's some legal scholars that could give you a good discussion on that.
Thank you. Ruel, you're up next.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for coming and speaking with us today.
Sure.
Most of your talk, you discussed how you were out to work with Congressman Chris Smith, I believe, on the autism community that you helped start. And I just wanted to ask you, if there is some mechanism that you think could be utilized in order to improve partisan relationships on both the House and the Senate. I think that's something that's an all-party kind of mechanism that could be solved that way. Or do you think it takes a more comprehensive approach, involves media, possibly education?
I think I've got your question. You were breaking up a little bit, but I've always, and I say our committee has a long history of working in a bipartisan fashion with our colleagues. It doesn't always happen, but I will tell you, as chairman of my subcommittee, it is always my intention to try to get the Republicans on board by addressing their concerns with legislation. And if it's something that we can work on together and fashion it in such a way that we can build support for it, it's the best thing to do, because it gives you your best chance of taking these ideas and making them reality. In divided government, you have to be able to get 60 votes over there in the other body, and you got to get a president to sign it. So, if you just pass legislation with one party only, and there's no input from the other side, chances are that bill's never going to become law. Now, there's certain things you can't compromise on. And on those things, we just agree to disagree, and we move forward if it's something that we think is very important and want to move it out of the House of Representatives. But I also think that the Congress is a reflection of America. People say that Congress is divided. America is divided. That's why Congress is divided, because each one of us represent a little piece of the country. I represent 1/435th of America, and that tends to be about 710,000 people that I represent. And if I'm not expressing their concerns, their hopes, their dreams, the things that they need in the United States Congress, my application for my job comes up every 2 years, and I have to reapply. And you're not going to be there much longer if you're not expressing that. So when you see a divided Congress, I also see a divided country. And I think one of the things that has caused that, I come in at a time when the internet was just getting started, 94. There was no social media. There were very few cable stations. CNN was it. We have people now getting information out of a fire hydrant without a filter on it. And so they have to sort of decide for themselves, is this true? Is this not true? Some people tend to seek validation. They only listen to those things that validate what they already think. This has made it very hard to get consensus on tough issues. There's a lot of, the internet's the greatest, most horrible invention in the world. It has been the source of much good and the source of much evil. Think QAnon, how we have millions of Americans that actually believe that there's some satanic democratic cabal that's, running a child slavery ring and to cause people to show up in a pizza shop with a gun, thinking he's rescuing people in the basement. I mean, these are actually real things that are happening. And it's one of the issues my committee has to deal with all the time, is this disinformation and misinformation on these internet platforms. And how do you stop that? You know, we have a section called Section 230, which gives these platforms a liability protection against what a third party posts. But they're supposed to have a responsibility to make sure that they police those sites too. But then we get into these, you know, free speech arguments. So I think all of us, when you ask Americans, would you like to see us not fight with each other so much? They all say yes, as long as you want to do what they want you to do. And I'm just saying, you know, this is still a very divided country. And when you have a country that's, you know, split down the middle like it is, you're gonna see these divisions reflected in the people who represent them.
Thank you. We are going to take only one or two more questions. I know we are coming up on the hour. So Aden, you've had your hand up for a moment. So if you can go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Congressman. I was just wondering, what are you going to do to make sure that every vote is counted in this election?
Well, that's a good question. And you know, you see the disparity state to state. In our state legislature, which the House and Senate is both controlled by Republicans, refused to allow us a few days before the election to start to process mail-in ballots. Those ballots have to be taken out of an envelope and unfolded before they can be stacked and processed into these scanning machines. That's a labor-intensive and time-consuming operation. So we wanted to get 3 or 4 days in advance to start at least processing them, getting them prepared to run them in the scanners, so that we could have the results on election night. But we couldn't get the legislature to agree to that. And each state sets their own guidelines. In Florida, they're allowed to start processing their mail-in ballots 30 days before the election. So one of the reasons on election night, Florida will be one of the first states to report, is twofold. Their poll closes, I believe, before 8 o'clock, 7:30 or 7. And secondly, they've had 30 days to process their mail-in ballots. They're going to be able to get those results in sooner. But to me, any ballot and in Pennsylvania, by the way, we're not a state that just mails a ballot to every voter. We don't do that. We only mail ballots to those people who apply for one. So you have to apply for a ballot and they check to make sure you're a registered voter, and then they mail you that ballot. Anybody that mails that ballot in before the election date, before November 3rd, should be counted. That to me is a legitimate ballot. Now, if for some reason the Postal Service doesn't get that ballot there to a day or 2 or 3 later, it's still to me a valid ballot. Now, right now, the state Supreme Court ruled that we can continue to count ballots that come in up to 3 days after the election, so long as they were postmarked by the election date. And if the postmark is illegible, they went further to say that it should be assumed that it was postmarked before November 3rd. That's been challenged in the Supreme Court. They tried to get a stay on that, and the Supreme Court ruled against that. They said there wasn't time to make a ruling, but they didn't say they wouldn't rule. So what Pennsylvania's had to do is we're segregating those ballots that come in after Election Day. Excuse me, we're counting them, but it's gonna be a separate count from the ballots that come into the thing by Election Day. That way, it's twofold. It may be a case because people realize that they need to get their ballots in so that this doesn't happen, that it's going to be a small number. And if the margin of victory is large enough that those ballots don't impact the election one way or the other, then it becomes a moot point. So I think it makes sense to segregate them and wait and see. But they absolutely should be counted. And, for all the bluster of the president saying he's going to have all his attorneys file lawsuits, we have attorneys too, and we have the law on our side. And I feel fairly confident that the courts are going to make proper rulings on this. The idea that, Trump thinks the Supreme Court's just going to make him the president, I think is just one of the many delusions that he has from day to day. So I feel like our ballots are going to be counted.
Thank you. We've gotten a couple of questions in the chat regarding climate change, whether or not you are in favor of rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement, impact of fracking on the environment, and anything Congress can do to help climate change. If you could comment on that.
Yeah, I will tell you that our caucus and our committee takes this very seriously. We are absolutely committed to rejoining the Paris Climate Accords and to doing what the IPCC has recommended to put us on a pathway to net zero carbon by 2050, sooner if technology allows us to do that. But we are going to be guided by science and by what the experts tell us we need to do. A lot of people focus on the power sector. You know, this is really a three-pronged thing. It's transportation, it's buildings, and it's power. There's lots we can do. I believe you're going to start to see the continued electrification of our transportation sector. You're going to see energy efficiency and building standards to make our buildings more energy efficient and to retrofit those buildings that aren't. And then in the power sector, as we develop things like battery storage technologies and these advanced nuclear reactors, they're small scale that allow us to put renewables like wind and solar on the grid, but to make them act like base capacity by being able to store the energy in these battery storage systems, or when the wind and the sun aren't providing the energy, that the small 60 megawatt nuclear power plant provides the energy during those periods where renewables don't. And then, you know, all the scientists tell us too, that we're going to have to continue to develop carbon capture and sequestration technologies. Remember, this is global climate change, not United States climate change or Western Pennsylvania climate change. And that's going to be necessary for us to reach our goal of net zero carbon. I don't support banning fracking right now because it would just lead to an increase in the use of coal. Right now, we've seen emission levels come down as as natural gas has supplanted coal, and that most of the electricity we see today is being generated by natural gas and nuclear. When you look at our energy mix the way it is today, 20% of it is nuclear, 20 to 25%. That's greenhouse gas-free baseload power. But the problem is a lot of those nuclear energy plants are going offline. They become very expensive, and you're not seeing a lot of building of new nuclear power plants. So if a nuclear plant goes down, you're losing greenhouse gas-free baseload capacity. And I think, you know, that's a dangerous thing too. We need to make sure that those plants that we have that are still online and still have a useful life are able to be operated to the end of the useful life. And that natural gas is going to be a bridge fuel till we get to the point where we're able to put more renewables on the grid by advancing battery storage technologies and other technologies that allow us to continue to build that portfolio. So I don't think it makes a lot of sense, to do this in immediate terms. There's going to be a transition that takes place over time. I do think that our funding, our tax credits, and our subsidies should be, all geared towards advancing these technologies and renewables. I don't think we need to provide subsidies for oil and gas anymore, or coal. That the fossil fuel industry is a mature industry. I think coal is on the way out, by the way. I don't think that has a future at all. But I think, as far as oil and natural gas, they're mature industries. They don't need to be subsidized. We should be putting our efforts in renewables and technologies that are going to allow us to get to net zero carbon as quick as we can. Some people want to do it by 2030. Most of us and most of the scientists I've talked to don't believe that's practical. But we are committed to getting it done, and we're going to stick to the science. But the fossil fuels are going to be with us for a while and into the foreseeable future. It's a big issue here in the campaign. Everybody's telling, Joe Biden's going to ban fracking. He's not going to ban fracking. He did say he didn't want to see new fracking on federal public lands, but most of that occurs in Western Pennsylvania. That's not a case. So that people in that industry are going to continue in that industry for the foreseeable future as we develop the technologies we need to, get more renewables on the grid and lessen our dependence on fossil fuels. So that's what I think is going to happen.
Well, thank you, Congressman Doyle. We are out of time. Great questions, great town hall. Good luck tomorrow on your reelection.
Thank you.
Hopefully we have a safe, peaceful transition, whatever the results of the election are. For those of you who have not yet voted, please do so safely as possible. If you are intending to do a vote by mail, I would suggest that you personally hand that ballot to a county elections official, or instead take your mail-in ballot to your polling place and instead file a provisional ballot at this point, because there's no guarantee that your ballot will be returned to the election officials by postmarked by election day. So the safest possible way is to cast your vote in person, safely, wearing a mask, and as the CDC recommends, bringing your own pen and some hand sanitizer. So thank you again to Congressman Doyle.
And Jonathan, let me add that if you still have your mail-in ballot, if you have the ballot and the envelopes, you can take that to the polling place and they'll spoil that ballot and allow you to vote there. If you don't have your ballot, Jonathan's right, you can still go to the polls and you can vote provisionally. And when they verify that you haven't mailed one in, then your vote will count. And then, of course, the third thing you can still do is you can go down to the County Elections Bureau. They're open from 8 in the morning till 8 at night, and you can still turn in your ballot there. Don't put it in the mail, please. Don't put it in the mail. Election day, I'm going to be visiting polls, just thanking people for voting and encouraging them to stay in line, but do it safely, socially distant, wear the mask, bring your hand sanitizer, bring a pen. This is all good advice, Jonathan. I just wanted people to know that if they actually have their ballot and envelopes in hand, they can take them there, get them spoiled, and actually vote that day, and it will count that day. But thanks for this forum. It's always a pleasure to engage students and faculty at Carnegie Mellon. It's one of the great universities in the country, and I'm proud to have them in my congressional district. And I hope everybody exercises their right to vote tomorrow. So thanks.
Again, join me in thanking Congressman and have a good election day, and thank everybody for coming.
Thank you.